Chapter 1 24th of February, Mykolaiv. In a sharp shock, Solomia woke up to the blaring and dreadful sound of the air raid alarm. Her head was spinning and she was utterly confused, unable to comprehend what was happening. She felt her throat convulsing and her heart racing in her chest. As her senses came to her and she regained awareness of her surroundings, she understood what this horrifying sound meant. It meant the worst had come. The war had started and there was no going back. Mere seconds later she heard booming noises in the distance and planes flying by very fast. Explosions already? Was the first question in her head. She jumped off her bed as quickly as possible and rushed to the window. Timur, her partner, was also up by now. "Don't stand so close to the windows, dear. It's dangerous," he said as soon as he saw where Solomia was standing. She listened to his advice and stepped away from it. More explosions were heard in the distance, each one causing her to shudder in fear. "We need to get to safety. They're bombing us already," she spoke in a slightly trembling voice, still coming to terms with the situation. With great haste, the two of them put on their coats, right on top of the pajamas they were wearing, and rushed to the front door. They lived on a third floor of an apartment building and needed to get all the way down to the basement level where they could take shelter. The other people living in the same building were also coming down the stairs, running to take shelter in a sense of panic. Everything felt hazy and unreal, like it was all a bad dream. Once on the ground level, they opened the heavily worn-down cellar door and headed down the steps. It was dark and excessively dusty in there. The air was cold and stale and made Solomia cough it out the moment she stepped inside. The steps leading down into the basement were irregular and parts of them were chipped. It was very easy to misplace one's foot and fall down, so Solomia tried to be extra careful and watch where she was going. The steps ended and led out into a small, square-shaped chamber with dull grey walls, a low ceiling, and a mixture of dirt and sand all over the floor. The air was even more stale down there, but nobody cared about that anymore. The most important thing was to get to safety in case the building was hit by a missile. Nobody wanted to die, and staying safe was paramount. Timur flicked the light switch in the basement. A couple of small light bulbs went on, giving just enough light to let everyone see the room and the people next to them. Some of the people that came down with them brought flashlights too for some extra light. "Now I guess we sit and wait," Timur turned to Solomia. There was nowhere to sit in the basement, no chairs or benches, no large rocks or bricks even. Just the unhealthy-looking dirt all over the entire floor. A couple of the people that came down brought blankets with them and set them down on the ground. Solomia and Timur, however, did not bring anything to sit on, so they just grabbed an old wooden plank that was leaning against the wall and set it down on the ground. Once they sat down, Timur put his arm around Solomia and pulled her closer to himself. Solomia rested her head on his shoulder and closed her eyes, feeling scared and trying hard to hold back the tears. The other people also sat quietly and with a pensive expression on their faces. Some were on their phones, while others were talking to each other in a low tone of voice. The sudden attack shocked everyone, and nobody could fully believe that it was really happening. 2 minutes went by when Solomia's mobile phone rang. She opened her eyes the moment it rang and took it out of her coat pocket. Her parents were calling her. "Didn't realize the signal could reach all the way down here," she muttered and picked up the phone. Her father, Sergei, was on the line. "Hi, Dad."
"Solomia, dear, are you okay? Are they bombing your city as well?"
"Yeah," she gave a short reply as she couldn't gather enough energy to explain what was going on.
"And are you still at home?"
"We're in the basement with Timur and the others. What about you and Mum?"
"Kiev is getting shelled too, so we're also staying in the shelter. Your mom is really scared. Everyone here is. I'm worried for you too. Please don't go outside."
Sergei's voice was sadder now. "But I have to go to work, Dad. I am needed, especially at a time like this."
"I understand. Just please try to be as careful as possible and only go out if necessary. And keep us informed if everything is fine with you."
"I will, Dad. Thanks. You too, please stay safe there." The call ended here. Solomia put the phone back in her coat pocket and rested her head on Timur's shoulder again. Her parents were far away from her, in Kiev, so she could not physically help them, and they could not do the same for her. What to expect from the day ahead was unclear. The more she thought about it, the more it worried her. Her worst fears had materialized. The dreaded war that many were anticipating had actually started, and nobody managed to prevent it. 24th of February, Kiev. The air raid alarm seemed to have stopped for the time being. The 25-year-old Alexei got up on his feet and walked over to the window in the next room. His mother, Irina, and his sister Diana, who was only 3 years younger than him, were also there in the same room. They were in a much more anxious state than he was. "Is it safe?" Irina asked. "I don't know. Probably," Alexei wasn't sure, but continued looking out of the window to check how things were outside. They lived in a small apartment block consisting of only 5 floors. Their apartment was on the 2nd floor, so they were in a safer position than the people who lived above them. However, upon hearing the air raid alarm for the first time this morning, they all hid in the kitchen, as it was further away from the outside wall than all the other rooms in their apartment. The alarm had a terrifying sound, one they did not expect they would have to hear. But alas, this morning it came on, signaling that the war had started and their country was under attack. Irina and Diana were still reluctant to exit the kitchen, fearing the worst. Alexei continued looking out of the window for any signs of the enemy planes. "I think it's safe for now." "I still cannot believe it's happening," Diana murmured in a sad voice. "What do they want from us? We've done them no harm." "It would be best for you two to evacuate from the city," Alexei stated after a few seconds of thought. "Alexei, you are also coming with us," his mother Irina insisted. "It's no point, Mom. I won't be allowed to leave the country anyway." "Then we'll stay here too." "It's a bad idea. You know that you need to get Diana out of here, out of danger." "I've already lost your father 8 years ago. I cannot lose you too, Alexei." Irina began crying, tears streaming down her face. "I'll be fine. Dmitro is here. He'll always be around to help me if I need it." Dmitro was Alexei's friend for the past 3 years and worked in the same car garage shop. They were about the same age and often helped one another. Alexei knew he could always rely on his best friend in any difficult situation. Irina buried her face in her hands, thinking in silence. Diana sat still next to her, taking deep breaths and feeling unsure about this whole situation. "You'll have to leave Kiev today," Alexei said after a minute. "Russians will likely reach us by tomorrow. Our time is short." "You've already packed the suitcases, yes?" "Most things, yes," Diana confirmed. "Then we shouldn't lose much time." It took nearly a full hour for Irina and Diana to agree that it was best for them to flee Kiev. Alexei promised to them that if things got really bad in the city, he would leave it and head to the western Ukraine, where it would likely be safer. He helped them both to finish packing their suitcases, and by lunchtime they were on their way. They used the metro to get to the Vokzalna station, which was located right next to the main overground railway station. Alexei carried their suitcases the entire way while they walked behind him, shaken and without hope. There were many other people at the station too, also fleeing Kiev with only 1 suitcase worth of possessions, leaving their home behind into uncertainty. Many were with little kids, trying to get the young away from where they could get harmed. On the platform the crowds were even larger. People were so numerous and so densely packed on the platform that it was a challenge to pass through them, even in single file. The atmosphere there was one of fear and sorrow. People were crying, saying goodbyes to loved ones, trembling and holding their kids tightly by the hand. It was a dreadful feeling, as though the world was ending. To Alexei, the scene of the hectic crowds at the train station platform reminded of the old photos of World War II he'd seen. A feeling of disbelief overcame him within a sudden moment. He felt unusually dizzy and began asking himself if all this was real, and if the events of 2014 that occurred in Donbass were repeating themselves, but this time in the whole country. Memories flooded him of the time when he, his mother and his sister were fleeing Donbass when the fighting there had only started in 2014. His father stayed behind to fight, and a few weeks later he was reported among the dead. It was the darkest patch of Alexei's life and he never forgot it. They spent such a long time pushing through the crowds on the platform and queuing up to board the train that it felt like an eternity. Alexei could not tell if only minutes passed or hours. Once they reached the train, Alexei handed the suitcases to Irina and Diana. They were both in tears. "It's not too late to come with us, dear," Irina said to her son. "I have to stay here, Mom. I am of more help here than in the west of Ukraine." "I understand. Your father would have been so proud of you if he was still alive." "I know. Please go safely. We'll keep in contact at all times. Let me know when you reach Lviv." Irina gave her son a hug, not wanting to let him go. Once she released him, Diana hugged Alexei too. "If you are in any danger, Alexei, you let us know, okay?" Diana told him after they finished hugging. "Don't go being a hero. Mama and I need you to be alive." Alexei nodded in agreement and watched as his mother and sister boarded the train. It was difficult to be separated from them after having lived all his life with them. But he knew it was for the best. He knew it was for their safety. And perhaps soon in the future they'd be back again, or he'd leave Kiev and be together with them again. Despite the overwhelming feeling of sorrow, he felt a small but noticeable glimmer of hope. They looked out of one of the windows in the train and met his gaze just as the train began departing. As the train was moving, the sight of his mother and sister in the window was moving further and further away from him too, until he could no longer see them. Once the train was gone, Alexei felt an overpowering sense of loneliness and vulnerability. That was it. His dear family was no longer with him, and he was all alone in a city that was about to get besieged by a ruthless enemy. It all dawned on him at once, and he wished he would have gone together with his mom and sister. "No, I am not all alone. I have Dmitro and other friends here. We'll stick together," he convinced himself. He decided it was a good idea to meet up with Dmitro in the city center. So from the Vokzalna station he took the metro to the Khreshchatyk station, which was located on the central street of the same name in Kiev. Many people were taking shelter in the metro, and the Khreshchatyk station was full of people finding a little corner for themselves and their children. Because it was very cold, most of them wore coats or warm jackets, as well as woolly hats and even mittens at times. Some were wrapped up in warm blankets and had food and some of their possessions with them. They didn't know how long they would be there for, and came prepared. There were masses of people stretching out along the hallways and even on the stairs, everyone scared and unsure of what to expect next. Small children were a little less aware of the situation and were running around and playing with each other, trying their best to entertain themselves. Some of the people had their dogs or cats with them, keeping them company in this difficult time. Alexei was walking past all the people, looking at them and feeling the pain of each one. Many were tired and were trying to get some sleep or were simply at a loss and trying to stay alive. He ascended via the escalators, reached the surface and headed to where his friend Dmitro agreed to meet him. The air raid alarm continued sounding and many people in the street were in a hurry, either to take shelter or to leave the city. Khreshchatyk and other streets in the center no longer felt the same as before. There were fewer people around as most were scared to be outside or had already left the city in the days prior. There was a general feeling of gloom enveloping the city and seeping into each person. Dmitro was already waiting for him at their agreed meeting spot. He was slightly taller and bigger than Alexei, and unlike Alexei, he had a short beard which was always scruffy. "Good to see you, brother," Dmitro greeted his good friend. "Air raid alarm did not scare you out of your wits?" "It's scary, all right. But since when did that stop us?" Alexei replied and then changed the topic. "Did Vadim say anything about us coming to work today?" Vadim was their boss, who owned the car garage shop where they worked. They had a lot of respect for the man as they knew how hard he worked to get his business off the ground and continuing to operate despite the pandemic and other troubles of recent years. "He said not to come today or tomorrow as things are quite unpredictable," Dmitro answered whilst gazing all around the street they were on. "None of us knows what the hell is going to go down here in the next few days. It's all a mess, brother. I'm not too worried for myself, but for Lilia." Lilia was Dmitro's wife, whom he knew since high school and married a couple of years back. "Does she insist on staying here in the city?" Alexei asked. "Yeah. Says she has nowhere else to go and no one else to be with. We'll pull through this one way or another. We have to." "Damn right we will. Have you heard? They'll be handing out guns to anyone who wants to fight and defend the city. I think we should each get one too. When those damned Russian orcs come here, there will be a lot of fighting in the city. I intend to be armed and dangerous when they dare to show themselves." "I haven't thought of that, but it sounds like a good idea. I am not going to sit here in fear and do nothing either. We all need to fight as it seems. What choice do we have?" Alexei agreed with his friend. "Do you know where they're going to give out the guns?" "No, but we'll find out. Let's go." 24th of February, Mariupol. The 17-year-old Daniil and his 13-year-old sister Lera were both sitting on the sofa and watching their parents, who were hastily walking around the apartment and preparing a small bag of supplies. The shelling had stopped temporarily, so they needed to get prepared before it resumed again. Daniil was feeling anxious about his parents going to fight the invaders, and he could see that his sister was worried for them even more. Both of his parents had been serving in the military for several years, and now they were heading perhaps into the biggest fight of their entire lives. "I wish Mom and Dad didn't have to go to fight," Larry began, snapping Daniil from his thoughts. "I wish nobody had to fight. Why can't we all just live in peace?" "I share your view, little sis," Daniil responded. "Unfortunately, this world is full of very nasty people, so there will always be fighting. One day all this fighting will be the end of us all. Humanity won't survive it." Daniil gave those last words a thought. He could feel the sadness and hopelessness in his sister, and he was feeling really sorry that she had to face the situation so early in her life. And yet, there was some truth in her words. He understood perfectly well that constant wars did nothing other than destroy, and in time they could be the end of all humanity. Their mother and father finished preparing everything a few minutes later. Daniil and Lara got up and went downstairs together with them to say their goodbyes. "Daniil, we leave you in charge," their mother Svetlana said as she gave them both a hug. "Please take care of your sister, and take care of yourself too. Try to stay out of danger. This may be only temporary, but for as long as the danger persists, please stay safe." "We will try our best to be fine. We're more worried about you and Dad," Daniil said. "You are the ones going into the lion's den." "Yes, but that's what we have to do. Someone has to defend our beautiful city and the people in it." Their father Oleg also came up to them at this moment and hugged both Lara and Daniil at the same time. "Listen, if things get really tough here in the city in our absence, Daniil, you take your sister and get out of here. It will always be dangerous out there while invaders are attacking us, but if it gets worse here, you know what to do." He gave his children his advice. After giving their children one more hug, both Oleg and Svetlana got in a car and drove away, heading to the front line where they would be engaging the enemy head-on. Daniil and Lara continued standing motionlessly and watching as their parents' car departed and disappeared off into the distance. Lara began crying and gave her brother a tight hug, her face burrowing into his jacket. With her parents away and with no certainty of when they would be back, her brother was all she had left at that instant in time. Daniil was feeling really anxious. The thoughts at the back of his mind kept telling him that this was the last time he'd seen his parents. He tried his best to push those thoughts away, but a part of him found it hard to deny that they might be true. The cloudy grey sky above was only reflecting the same mood back at him and only confirming his worries. "Sis, why don't you go back inside? I need to go and see Dasha really quickly and then I'll be back," Daniil said after a few seconds flew by. Lara looked him in the face without a word and nodded in understanding. Daniil waited till his sister went back into the building and then headed to see Dasha. Dasha was his girlfriend who lived nearby and was the same age as him. Daniil knew that she and her family were planning to leave the city if the war started, so he wanted to be sure to see her before that. When Daniil got there, Dasha and her parents were outside, loading bags into the boot of their car. Dasha saw him approaching, but her face did not light up with a smile as it usually did when she saw him. She looked like a completely different person. "Dasha, how are you holding up? You decided to leave after all?" Daniil began. "It's terrible, Daniil, really terrible," she replied. "I know. Both of my parents have just left to go fighting on the front line. I don't know what will happen to them now. This city is not going to hold for long. You and Lara need to leave it. Why don't you come with us?" Daniil was at a loss for words. It was unthinkable to just get up and leave the city. And go where? They had no place to go to, no relatives anywhere else in Ukraine or outside it. "Dasha, He tried choosing his words carefully. "I don't think we can leave. Besides, the road out of here is very dangerous. Every meter of it is within enemy's firing range." "It's even more dangerous to stay here," Dasha argued. "We either take our chances with the road or we stay here and wait for the end to come." "I'm sorry, Dasha. I cannot go with you." Dasha brought her gaze down onto the ground with a disappointment. A tear came down her face a moment later and her lips folded slightly. "That's it then? We'll never see each other again?" she said in a quiet voice. "I don't know, Dasha. I wish I could tell you with certainty, but I really don't know what's going to happen in the next few days and weeks." She took a few deep breaths, trying to find her words. Her eyes were watering even more now. I guess it's a goodbye then. Daniil walked closer to her and grabbed her in a tight hug. She began crying and sniffling quietly so that her parents wouldn't hear her. Daniil did not want to let her go. He wanted her to stay with him so that they could spend their days together and perhaps marry in the future, but the circumstances made this impossible. Dasha was leaving and was likely never returning. Neither of them knew if they'd still be alive tomorrow. They had no clue and no control of where life would take them. There was no point clinging to the empty hope that they might be together again. No matter what they wanted, destiny had other plans, and they were powerless to do anything about it. 25th of February, Bucha. It was past midday on the 25th of February already. The shelling in areas surrounding Kiev was intensifying. A lot more missiles were whistling through the air, and more fighter jets were flying overhead. Maria was in the basement of her house, holding her 8-year-old daughter Alina close to herself and refusing to let her go. Her husband Artur was also there with them. They spent a few hours that day in the basement, hiding from danger coming from above. The nightmare that started the day before was continuing, and with each passing moment the reality of it all was infiltrating Maria's mind and terrifying her. "I think the bombing has stopped for now," Artur proclaimed after some time and opened the door to the outside. Maria and Alina came closer as well and peered outside. It was calm. Hesitantly, all three of them exited the basement and walked over to the front door of their house. A few of their neighbors were also already outside. To their relief, no houses nearby were hit by missiles, at least not yet. They lived in a nice and picturesque neighborhood. Each house was pleasant looking from the outside and had a small garden. Once inside, Alina ran to her room, while Maria and Artur sat down in the living room, thinking about how they would get through this. They were still a relatively young couple and had a big portion of their lives ahead of them. And with their daughter growing up, they knew they had to give her the best life possible. "Surely they won't hurt us, right?" Maria began. "I mean, we're just civilians. We mean anyone no harm. And they're like brothers to us. They've always lived among us and we among them." "If that was so, they wouldn't be attacking us right now," Artur pointed out. "They probably just want to change the government. That seems to be their main goal. I bet our politicians have fled already." "Not really. Zelensky is staying in the capital, so is the mayor of Kiev, and all the others are too. Do those guys have a death wish or something? The Russian forces will practically be parading in Kiev by tomorrow." "I don't know, dear," Artur gave up. "We just need to worry about staying safe and keeping Alina out of harm's way. That is my number one priority right now." Maria nodded in agreement and began thinking whilst looking down. She remembered how a couple of her friends were panicking about the possibility of the war starting, but she refused to believe them. It seemed incomprehensible and absurd that Russia would attack them in full-scale war. And yet it happened anyway, despite how hard it was to believe. If only she listened to her friends and fled the country in time, her daughter would have been in safety now. But then her husband would have been all by himself, as men were not allowed to leave the country at this time. She didn't know if staying there was for the best or if leaving was. That didn't seem to be an ideal scenario. The next few days would clear everything up, she thought. At this moment, Alina came up to her mother. She saw how sad Maria looked and gave her a hug. Maria was so lost in thought that she didn't notice her daughter come close to her until the moment Alina hugged her. And once they were hugging, the tight knots of pain Maria was feeling inside began to slowly disappear. She was hoping this moment would never end. 25th of February, Kiev. Evening time had come in Kiev. There was a lot more shelling this past day, and more plane fighting could be heard in the skies. The airspace above Kiev was still being heavily contested between the defenders and the invaders. Neither side was willing to give the other air superiority. There was very little time to organize serious defenses over this past day, so the soldiers and a few volunteers put up some makeshift defenses and barricades, mainly by placing big vehicles on the roads to make it harder for the military vehicles of the invaders to pass through. Alexei and his friend Dmitro were standing on one of the main streets in Kiev, weapons in hand. Many other men were there too, volunteering to fight and defend their dear city. They knew the Russian soldiers were practically on the doorstep now and would reach Kiev within hours. It was terrifying, and to make it all worse, it was very cold and windy. Alexei could feel his fingers going slightly numb whilst clutching the gun in his hands. He was glad he put on a warm jumper and a fleece on top and wore a beanie hat. This could be a long night, and he needed to keep as warm as possible. "How are you holding up, brother?" Dmitro asked, snapping Alexei from his internal contemplation. "Scared, of course," Alexei admitted with full honesty. "Me too," Dmitro nodded. "I'd bet that every one of us here is scared, but we are all united by a common purpose." "That's true." "Your family got to the border yet?" "They're in Lviv right now. There are huge crowds and queues at the train station. They decided to spend the night in the city and attempt to cross the border tomorrow." "Glad they got far away from here in time. Wish my Lilia was with them." Alexei knew that Dmitro was really worried for his wife and would do anything to protect her. He understood that most men here did not want to fight, but had to for the sake of their families and loved ones. Taking up arms and fighting was the lesser evil when the alternative was to see your family get hurt. "What about you, fella? Do you have a family here?" Dmitro turned to a man who was standing next to him. The man looked about 50 years of age and was of average height. Clearly wasn't a soldier. "Yeah," the man responded. "Have a wife here and a daughter who lives in Mykolaiv." "Damn, I heard things are pretty bad in Mykolaiv right now." "It's true. I worry for my Solomia greatly, but she's firm in her purpose to save people. She's a nurse and I'm proud of her." "I hope she stays safe there," Alexei spoke with encouragement. "I hope all of us stay protected from the worst." The man nodded in agreement and Dmitro put his hand on Alexei's shoulder reassuringly. They were all in this together, brothers in arms, ready to face the incoming nightmare side by side, shoulder to shoulder. Minutes and hours went by. Alexei spent all the time virtually on the same spot, having nothing more than a couple of protein bars to keep the hunger at bay. He wished that the whole night would go by like this and be uneventful. It was much more preferable for him to worry about cold and boredom than actual fighting. However, soon he could hear more shelling somewhere in the distance, as well as sharp, popping noises of gunshots. This meant that the enemies were on the outskirts of the city already, and they were coming here. They were getting closer, and a big fight was inevitable.